All right, we are back to section 3 of our Urban Teaching and Leadership Conference under the theme, It Takes a Village. And as we head into this final section, we're going to get to hear from more of our community as well as Liz Huntley.
Let's hear from our next Village Spotlight, an organization called Safe Families, and how their mission embodies the spirit of It Takes a Village.
So my name is Laura Lee, and the mission of Safe Families is to surround families in crisis with caring and compassionate community. There are many reasons why a parent calls us for help, but the top ones are homelessness, often due to eviction. That's a really, really common one for us. Secondly, would be a medical crisis, a scheduled surgery, an urgent surgery, or even when a parent needs to go give birth at the hospital but has other children and doesn't know what to do with them. And then another one would be a mental health crisis, our treatment, drug treatment, and then finally domestic violence. So those are the top reasons why a parent gets spurred on to seek help from Safe Families. So for Safe Families, It Takes a Village really means having multiple layers of support come along a parent and a family to see them succeed. So for Safe Families, we have really 4 main volunteer roles that form a village around a parent and a family and kids. The first one being a host family. When a hosting is needed, we have people who will take in children for temporary times, 2 days, 45 days, kind of somewhere in there, and they will just love on those kids, love on the parent, and welcome them into their extended family. So, and then another volunteer role is the family friend. That's somebody who will be an advocate, be a listener, an encourager, and a friend. In those really hard times, we all need somebody to just talk with. And then the third role is a family coach. This is somebody who really takes on that accountability for the parent and checking in with them, also providing resources. Have you tried this other organization for this resource? Have you looked into this? Those kinds of things. So really coaching the parent to get to where they want to be. And then finally, we have a resource friend. This is somebody who can just donate supplies, donate meals, just help with those really practical things. And so those are our 4 volunteer roles that all come around every situation that comes on Safe Families' radar, and they will surround that parent with caring and compassionate community. So for me personally, I felt really propelled to host because I had seen how being a host family led to that entire volunteer family becoming closer to each other and also closer to God and expanding their definition of what family can mean. So I was really motivated to do that for myself personally. And so one story I'd like to share about hosting is we got the email and request to host a little girl. This is right in the beginning of the pandemic. When her school shut down, her mom was unable to find daycare options at all that worked for her and her schedule. She had just gotten a brand new job that was really uplifting to her, and she really feared that she would lose her job when the schools closed their doors. So with Safe Families, we said, well, let us host this little girl who's 6 years old until you can find an option, or we will try to help you find an option, but there will be a safe place for her until we find that option. So we ended up hosting her for about 6 weeks. It was a joy to host her. She is just a brilliant little girl who got along with my son super well, and we were able to stay in touch with her mom throughout the whole thing. I mean, she and her mom have the most beautiful relationship. It's very, very cute. And just cheerlead them during this really hard time. I recognized how painful that must be. But we were also able to do her virtual schooling with her and kind of figure that out with her, which she did really well in. And just absolutely joyful time of 6 weeks during the pandemic when we were really stuck together. There was not that much that we could do outside of our house, but we bonded really, really well. And she became like a cousin or pretty close to being a sibling to my 2-year-old son. And so we loved her. And I think that this is a huge success story because in the end, she went right back to being with her mom. She never doubted that she would go right back to being with her mom. Also, we've stayed in touch. And so just this weekend, on Saturday, we were hanging out with her mom and her at the park and eating chips and stuff. So, it's all about relationships and forming that support system. So we have been blessed to continue to be that support system for them during the rest of the pandemic and hopefully much further beyond. If you are part of a local church that you can imagine wanting to get involved with Safe Families, reach out to me. I love hearing from churches who have a heart for families in their communities and not just serving quickly, but getting in deep and getting in a personal relationship with families in the community. That's huge of what Safe Families is, and I'd encourage you to get involved with Safe Families and to make this a part of the DNA of your church.
Thank you so much for your work in the community, Safe Families. What a great resource. Safe Families really embodies the philosophy of a village by connecting resources to the individuals who need it the most.
That's so great. And I also just loved hearing her personal testimony, which we have somebody else who's coming up on deck to speak who also shares her personal testimony and how the village impacted her from sort of a child's perspective in the matter. So I'd like to introduce Liz Huntley. Liz Huntley is an accomplished litigation attorney and dedicated child advocate. She's an author, she's a lecturer, there's not a whole lot she doesn't do. She practices law at Lightfoot, Franklin and White LLC in Birmingham, Alabama. She's the recipient of many honors, including the National Black Lawyers Top 100 organization and selected by Super Lawyers as a 2019 Mid-South Super Lawyer. She's the president and co-founder of the Hope Institute, which is an organization in Alabama that builds character and culture for students. She was recently named the 2020 Momentum Top 5 Women of Impact in Alabama. She's written the book More Than a Bird, which we've enjoyed studying that book as well. And she's earned her law degree from the University of Alabama School of Law, where she now serves on the Law School Foundation Board of Governors. Like I said, there's not a whole lot she hasn't done. So without any further ado, let's turn it over to Liz Huntley.
Hello, and thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of this conference. I cannot tell you how excited I am, albeit virtually, to be together with you as we share our common cause, our love for children. And I could not be even more as excited as I am about this conference theme, It Takes a Village, because it certainly does. And no one knows that better than me and my story of how the village of teachers and community poured into my life to help me stand before you today. Many of you have read my bio and know that I am really blessed to do incredible work as a litigation attorney, that I'm a founder of an organization that helps schools build a culture of character, and most importantly, I'm a wife and a mom of 3 beautiful children. I could not be more blessed, and I'm certainly thankful for all that God has given me. And let me say that I will mention God throughout my presentation, and I don't apologize for it. They asked me to come and share my story, and I can't talk about it without talking about Him. And we're here today to talk about one of His greatest ministries. It's a ministry to me, and that is education. You know, there are only two entities on the face of this earth whose sole purpose is to help human beings. That's the only reason they exist, to pour into who human beings will become as adults. The first one is the church. That's the sole purpose of the church, is to pour into human beings to help shape who they become. And the second one is the school. And as most of us know, the school started in the church, but that's another story. But this ministry is so critically important to shaping who children become as an adult. And I know it's a ministry because you're not doing it to get rich. I'm married to a teacher after all, and I certainly know that we're not going to get rich because of his life of service, of pouring into the young people that he pours into every day. And I could think of no greater service here on earth than that of a teacher, and the village that is created in a school building for children to give them hope. Let me tell you a little bit about my story because I know a little bit about hope. And most of you have read my book to know what that story is. But I want to personally share it with you today. As you know, I was born into a home where both of my parents were drug dealers. They dealt heroin in Huntsville, Alabama. We lived in the housing projects. It was a very stressful situation for them. But what's interesting is, even though I was in that home, we had 4 different daddies of the 5 children that were in the house, and there were people coming and going in our house all the time, and money piled up all over the tables, and you know, all kinds of characters that were round and about. It's really interesting how when a child is born into something and it's all they know, that that environment, as dysfunctional as it may be their normal. Because take a look at Liz at that time. You'll see this picture of me at 5 years old. And I think I was pretty cute. I had cute little pigtails, and I'm not sure about those ribbons in my hair, but I was a cute little kid. And if you look at this picture, you'll see that I'm bright and happy. And I was. Because when that dysfunction is your normal and the basic needs are being met, like food, shelter, nobody was really physically hurting me at the time. I had no clue what was going on with me around my world. I just knew I was with my siblings. I loved them. We hung out together as kids would. My mom and dad were in the house with me. I had no idea that they had this strained relationship and we were in all this dysfunction. And it didn't matter to me. I was just a kid whose basic needs were being met, and I explored like a kid. But whenever there's that level of instability, eventually something's going to happen. It can't sustain itself forever, particularly drugs and crime. And my parents were no exception. So when I was 5 years old, literally a few months after that photograph of me was taken, my dad got busted for dealing drugs and went to prison, and my mom started using their drug, broke the cardinal rule of drug dealing. She became a heroin addict. And for reasons unknown to me to this day, one day my mom packed up all of our clothes, and it was the end of the summer, so it wasn't unusual for us to go visit a grandmother or cousins or whatever. And she took me and my younger sister, who had the same dad, down to my paternal grandmother's home. She took my middle sister to Hueytown, a town about an hour away, to stay with an aunt. And she took my only brother and oldest sister back to Huntsville, where we lived, and arranged for them to be with her sister. And she went back to that housing project. She went upstairs and she took out a gun and she committed suicide. So now I know I'm in dysfunction, but I learned about it in such a harsh way. You see, I didn't have adults that were in my home that would sit down and go through things with me and help me understand and process what was going on and work through my grief. No, I figured out what was going on by overhearing grown folks talk. And I overheard grown folks saying things like this: what was she thinking, getting strung out on those drugs and stringing these 5 children all over the state for all of us to have to take care of? And then their sorry daddy, he's in and out of jail, blah, 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 blah. That's all I heard. Well, when you hear that all the time, what do you start to think? You start to think we're a burden on people, that nobody cares about us. And so my entire disposition started to change from that 5-year-old little girl that you saw in the picture. In fact, I went back in my community after I wrote my book, and I interviewed some of the elderly people in the community that would have known me during that time. And I asked them, what was I like as a little girl when I came and moved in with my grandmother? And this is what they told me. Particularly one lady, she said, "Sweetie," she was like, "it was really sad. When you came down here to stay with your grandma after your mama committed suicide, you were pitiful." She said, "You wouldn't talk to anybody. You wouldn't make eye contact with folks. You hung your head down. You mumbled when you talked. We used to have to tell you to speak up." And she said, "But baby, you know, you just snapped out of it. You just snapped out of it. And look at you now, all successful and educated. We're so proud of you." Now, we know that I didn't just snap out of it. I didn't just snap out of a a severely traumatic experience as what I was going through during that time. Because not only was I dealing with a parent that had committed suicide, not only was I dealing with a dad who was absent and in and out of prison, not only was I dealing with being separated from my siblings for the first time in my life, not only was I really dealing with poverty for the first time. And you may say, well, wait a minute now, you were living in a housing project with your grandmother. You moved into this poor situation from a poor situation with the housing project, but my parents were drug dealers. And because they were drug dealers, there were resources all the time. So I never knew a time of going without or not having all kinds of food and things at my fingertips. But my grandmother, she had left a very violent marriage, was raising the last three children from that marriage. And in doing so, she was making ends meet the best she could. And she cleaned houses for a living. And in doing that, with the governmental assistance that she received, things were tight. And so I went from stuff and food aplenty to not knowing if it's going to be 2 meals today instead of 3 meals today. It was a completely different experience for me. And the other thing that happened, and many of you educators have seen this dynamic before, I took on the role of somewhat of a parent to my younger sister. I was 5 and she was 3.5. And I felt like because we were somewhat abandoned, that I had to look out for her. So I took on this sort of nurturing role with my older sister that I'm sure many of you have seen among that group of siblings where there's a lot going on at home. Such a red flag that there's a lot going on at home. And so that was my disposition. And if all of that wasn't enough to deal with, within a month of me moving into that home with my grandmother, one of her adult sons started to sexually abuse me on a regular basis. So there I was, as broken can be, in as dark a situation as I could be. And as sweet as Miss Polly was to say that I just snapped out of it and to try to give me some credit for overcoming those challenges, she was just wrong. I didn't snap out of it. God brought me out of it. And he brought me out of it using the village in my community of educators and people that supported educators because they understood the value and importance of an education. Now, it was really interesting because it happened in such an odd way because we were still going through integration in my community and the all black school had closed down and black kids were being bused across town to what had been the all white school. So tensions were kind of high. Well, there were some ladies in the community that said, you know what? We want to make sure that our kids are ready to go to school when they go across town. So they opened a preschool. They partnered with the Union Baptist Church in my community, used their fellowship hall, got a grant from the Community Action Agency, hired some of the black educators that had lost their jobs during integration, and they started a preschool. And my grandmother, you have to know her to know that I was going to go to that preschool. My grandmother had a reverence for educators that was similar to leaders in a church because she understood the value of an education and the opportunities that it presented itself for not just her children, but now her grandchildren. And so I get up that morning to go to that little church preschool, and I remember it like it was yesterday. I remember walking down there knowing that everybody knew everybody's business, and they particularly knew my business. And I was ashamed. I mean, I was ashamed that my mom was a drug addict and had committed suicide. I was ashamed that my dad was in about out of jail. Everybody knew it. I was ashamed that we were so dirt poor that the kids made fun of us. And I was really ashamed of being sexually abused, even though at that time I had not reported it to anybody. Because let me tell you something about a child who's being sexually abused. Even when they don't tell anybody, they feel like you just know. When they walk into a room or they come in contact with someone, they feel like there's some sort of designation written on their chest for a person to see the vile, filthy things that are going on inside their home. That was my condition walking down to that school. And I'll never forget when I got to the school, I walked up and there was a man at the door, Mr. Willie. Mr. Willie was a deacon of the church who had retired and had volunteered his time to make sure the kids got safely into the school. And Mr. Willie looked at me and he said, "Well, hello, young lady, welcome." Now, you educators greet children in such a lovely, positive, nurturing way all the time. But I'm speaking to you today from behind the eyes of a child and explaining to you how therapeutic that is, how much healing comes from those nurturing engagements that come from educators. Because I was a child that walked into that school with a lot of aces, a lot of aces. And many of you know what aces are, but you'll see on the screen the 10 aces that exist that children suffer from. And as you look at that list, you'll also notice that I experience every single ace but one, and that was the separation of parents. Now, let me just say about that particular ace that not only did I not experience it, but there are kids who go through divorce with parents that don't experience it as an adverse childhood experience either, because it's only on the list when the divorce between parents create trauma for the children. It's not on the list just for the sake of divorce. So here I was walking into that school with all of those experiences, all of those stories behind my eyes. But Mr. Willie had sort of broken the ice for me. It's amazing how everybody in a school touches a child in some way. So I go on into the school. I don't know what to do. I stand at the landing of the stairs and I look around this big open floor plan in this fellowship hall for this preschool. And I remember I kind of smiled. And the reason I kind of smiled is because the room was so beautiful to me. I mean, I looked around the room and it had all these little bitty desks that were just my size. It was colorful and bright and all set up for this lovely, stimulating environment that I was going to get to be in all day. You know, sometimes educators complain about their building, and I understand it. I know you want a nice environment to come into, but never forget that for some children, that building might be the nicest place they'll ever be during that year. And so, you know, for me, living in the housing projects with cinder block walls and concrete floors and dirt for grass, this was an amazing environment that I was going to get to go to every day. And so I kind of smiled. But then the preschool teacher walked up to me and she put her arm around me and she said, "Come on in here, baby." And when that happened, I almost cried. I almost cried because I was starving for the touch of an adult, the nurturing touch. My grandmother was a hard taskmaster and she worked hard and long hours and tried to provide. So that part of her wasn't always there. And I was starving for it. And I got it from this school. And I'll never forget, I learned real quick that if you do this really smart stuff, all these academic worksheets and things that they handed to you, they would really love on you. And if you did really smart stuff, they will give you prizes and stuff that you could take home. So I thought, well, this is a good gig. All I got to do is all this little smart stuff they're giving me, and I'm going to get loved on and all these prizes. Well, I ended up doing so much smart stuff that I ended up being valedictorian in my kindergarten class. And I wasn't even trying to be valedictorian in my kindergarten class. All I was doing was responding to the love from those educators in that building, the high expectations that they had for me. They didn't compromise, even knowing the story behind my eyes. In fact, they understood the need for me to have a solid foundation was even greater because of the challenges that laid ahead because of my home situation. And for that, I'm so deeply grateful. In fact, as you'll see from this picture, I'm still connected to those teachers today as I continue to thrive and live myself in that community, my village, that I want to pour into as it poured so much into me. Now, what's significant about that, if you'll indulge me for a little bit of a science lesson, is I showed you the 10 ACEs. Now, we know in science that if a child experiences 4 or more of those ACEs before they reach the age of 6, that the negative power of those ACEs on their neurology, their brain development, particularly since 90% of the brain develops before a child reaches age 6, it could be so detrimental and permanently damaging. And there's no magical pill that can fix it. There is no therapy we know that doesn't involve removing the child or intervening in the family circumstances that can fix it. The only thing that will not only stop that negative neurology from happening to those children, but it can reverse damage that's been done. And that is the consistent exposure to a nurturing environment like I was in that preschool. So God used that preschool to literally save my life. And not only just save my life in that moment in terms of my brain development, but to give me a foundation that proved to be critical to my ability to thrive and survive and really be able to fully engage in that teacher village that surrounded me for the rest of my life to help shape who I am today, as so many of you have read in my story. So it really became important because remember, we were in the middle of integration, and here I was going to public school to be around white people for the first time. No offense to anybody in the audience. And so I was a little nervous. I get up that morning, 6 years old, ready to head to first grade. I put on my new clothes. I eat my breakfast. And my grandmother looks at me and she says, Elizabeth, I want you to go over to that school and I want you to tell the teacher to put an X everywhere I need to sign on the paperwork. Send it home and I'll send it back tomorrow. So it dawned on me. My grandmother wanted me to go to this school by myself at 6 years old. Y'all, I was terrified. But I was more scared of my grandmother, so I got my butt on that bus to go across town to that school. And I'll never forget when I got on the bus, my bus driver was Mr. Fulford. Mr. Fulford was a middle school teacher. And the bus in our neighborhood, because our neighborhood was so small, actually held from first grade to high school. And so the one bus carrying all the students would bounce from school to drop the kids off. So I was even more nervous that I was getting on this bus with all of these older kids. But Mr. Fulford, being the kind of educator that he was, when I got on the bus, he said, okay, now you sit right here behind me. And I remember sitting there next to some other younger kids. Now, we all know what Mr. Fulford was doing. He wanted to make sure the younger kids felt safe and secure because it was scary to get on the bus with all of the older kids. That's what teachers do. These game-changing things that they do in real time all the time that are just par for the course for them, but are amazing for a kid. Again, I'm telling you about this village that kids experience from behind the eyes of a child. So fast forward, I get to the school, don't know what to do. I walk in and I look on the wall and I see first grade. And I thought to myself, well, I'm going to first grade. I must be in the right place. Well, how did I know it said first grade? I didn't have any learning going on in my home. I knew it said that because of that preschool, that kindergarten, I was school ready. So I stood there a little longer, not knowing what to do. And there were all these sheets of paper on the wall with names on them. And parents would come in and they would scroll down the list and they would find their child's name. And they'd say, oh, little Susie, you're in such and such's room. And they'd go off into the module. So I thought, well, my name's got to be up there. I'm going to the first grade. So I scrolled down that list until I found my name. I saw what room I was supposed to go into, and I headed that way. Now, how did I know how to read, write, and spell my name? How did I know what room numbers were? How did I know how to navigate from room to room? Because of that preschool. I was school ready. So I get into the room, and I go sit in the front desk. I sat in the front desk because the ladies at the preschool told me, don't nothing good happen in the back of the classroom. When you get to that school, you better sit your butt in the front desk. So that's what I did. And there was chaos going on because it was the first day of school for everybody, whether you were white, black, rich, or poor. Everybody had anxiety about the first day of school. And the teacher was talking to a parent. There was a little boy crying in the corner. There was a little girl that didn't want to let go of her doll for the first time. It was just chaos. But eventually the teacher caught me out the corner of her eye, and she began to walk towards me. And as she walked towards me, I have a little bit of a confession to make. This lady had this beautiful black silk hair and these pretty colored eyes and this beautiful smile. And to me, she looked just like Wonder Woman. I am not kidding you. This was the 70s. The Wonder Woman show was on TV. I watched it all the time. And as a victim child, I often thought that Wonder Woman was going to come and save me from the bad people one day. So when this teacher started walking towards me, I thought in my little 6-year-old mind, could this be? Is my teacher Wonder Woman? Like, how cool would that have been? Well, it wasn't Wonder Woman. It was Miss Pam Jones. But she was my Wonder Woman, because let me tell you what happened next. Miss Pam Jones walked up and said to me, "Well, hello, young lady. What is your name?" And y'all, I panicked. I didn't know what to say. All that could come out of my mouth was, "My name's Elizabeth Humphrey, and my grandma told me to tell you to put an X everywhere she needs to sign on the paperwork, send it back home, and I'll send it back tomorrow." I just spit it out. I had rehearsed it over and over and over again, because those were my instructions as I went to school that day. Well, Miss Pam Jones paused. And as you all know, a lot of things could have happened in that moment. So many things that would have changed the course of time, and I could not be standing before you today. Miss Pam Jones could have called child services. And guess what? God rest my grandmother's soul. I will love the woman to the day that I die. But she was wrong to send me to school that day by myself. Miss Pam Jones could have said, "I don't have time to deal with this. I've got all this going on. You need to go to the guidance counselor's office to see Charlotte and let her figure out what to do with you." Well, you educators out there know the rest of that story. I would have had to wait for child services. There probably would have been some hearing, may have had to be removed, would have been a totally different first day of school. Or Miss Pam Jones could have done the worst thing that could have happened to me. She could have been one of those educators that brought their personal biases into the classroom with them. And I'm not talking about race here. I'm talking about the biases that we all have as human beings about who the sibling was that came before the child, or what neighborhood the child comes from, or who their parents were. A myriad of things, how they're dressed, how they're prepared in terms of their resources and supplies, all of those things that make people cast judgment on an individual. She could have been one of those educators who don't belong in a classroom. But instead, being the amazing educator that Miss Pam Jones was and will always be, she assessed that situation and determined, after we discussed how I'd found my way into the classroom, that my glass was actually half full, not half empty. You see, what Miss Pam Jones assessed when she truly looked at the child and not the circumstances was that I was a bright child, was that I was a child with a lot of potential, that I was a resilient child. And seeing that in me, with tears in her eyes, she bent down close to my face and said, "Elizabeth Humphrey, you are going to be the brightest student I ever have." That is the power of an educator. That is the power of a village that instills hope in a child. Now, I'll be honest, I was a little taken aback by it. I thought it was weird that the lady was about to cry. But because of my experience in preschool, I thought to myself, oh, well, I guess this is like preschool. If I just do smart stuff for her, she'll love on me too. And that's exactly what I did. In fact, I did so much smart stuff in Miss Pam Jones's room that by the time I left first grade, I was reading on a fourth and fifth grade level. And I was doing math on a second and third grade level. And I asked her years later, I said, "Miss Pam Jones, why did you teach me all that stuff all the time?" Because she was constantly putting something new in front of my face and having me learn all of this material. And this is what she said. She got emotional and said, "Elizabeth, I had no idea what was going to happen to you. I knew you'd come from a bad situation. I didn't know all the details. I had no idea if you would continue in our school system, if you'd have to leave, or what would happen. But I knew this. I knew that as long as you were on my clock, that God had put you on my clock, that I was going to pour everything into you that I could to help strengthen your foundation as you moved forward." Now, I will tell you, that woman is still loving on me today. In fact, when I gave birth to my second child, she was at my house keeping my first child. She always will be my Wonder Woman. And I have to show you, even today, I received an award earlier this year, and here's a picture of me with her where she was present there supporting me as she always has been. Totally a part of my village. And that was my story. The rest of my time through school, nothing changed in my house. In fact, it got worse because we had an uncle that moved into our home, who became very violent because he was discharged from the military. Something had happened to him emotionally, and he was mentally ill. And my grandmother tried to manage it, but it would get off kilter, and he would get violent, and we'd have to go to foster homes. It was just a roller coaster ride. But God always put those educators in my path that help continue to shape who I am, because they were my village. They were all that I had. I remember in 6th grade, I had a history teacher named Mr. Art Smith. Now, let me describe him to you. Mr. Art Smith, as some of you may have read in my book, was a middle-aged man who was retired military, who was about 5'1", white male, who wore a pocket protector and dark pants every day. And he was a strict disciplinarian. But even he, because this is what educators do, understood the story behind my eyes and wanted to find a way to help me. Because of Pam Jones and my passion for reading, I read all the time, and I always had a book in my hand. But I didn't know what to read. So when I read everything in the library, I started reading things by Stephen King and Dean Koontz. And I read those things not because I was so fascinated by scary stuff. I read them because they were sort of an escape. They helped me escape from my reality. Because in those books, there were two things going on. One, somebody had a worse life than me. And number two, it was so scary and gory that it allowed me to be able to escape my reality. And so that's what I did. And I always had a book in my hand. And I remember one day, as we were changing classes, Mr. Art Smith said, "Elizabeth, come here." And I went up to him, "Yes, sir." And he looked at me and he said, "Why do you read that crap all the time?" And I said, "Excuse me, that crap. Every time I see you, you got a book in your hand, and it's always a bunch of crap." And I looked at him and I said, "Well, Mr. Smith, what did you want me to read?" And this is what he said. He said, "Elizabeth, you've got so much potential." He said, "You need to be reading biographies. You need to be reading about ordinary people that did amazing things." Now, think about that. Mr. Art Smith did not have to stop and say anything to me. I was a bright kid. I didn't get in any trouble in his class, didn't cause him any problem, and yet he stopped to tell me that day. And years later, when I went to college, I saw Mr. Smith in a restaurant, and I asked him, I said, "Mr. Smith, why did you stop me that day and tell me I needed to read biographies?" And he too got emotional. And this is what he said. He said, "Elizabeth, I saw so much potential in you, and I didn't know what to do or how to help you. I was an older white male. You were this young black teenage girl, and I didn't know how to connect to you. But I noticed that you love to read. And so I thought that if I were to introduce you to reading biographies and reading about people that had to overcome tough circumstances, that it might inspire you to stay the course and overcome your circumstances too." Now, let me tell you what's so significant about that. When I went into the library that day, because I knew I'd better not show back up at Mr. Art Smith's class without a biography in my hand. And I asked the librarian to point me to the African American section. And I perused the books. And the book that I landed on, that I decided to read first, was Maya Angelou's "I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings." Now, for those of you who do not know that phenomenal woman, no pun intended, Maya Angelou was a phenomenal poet, writer, educator at NC Chapel Hill, actor, so many amazing things, who happened to have a childhood story similar to mine. So I read it and I was so inspired. So then I started reading all the biographies. I read Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, all of them, Harriet Tubman, Rosa Parks. I read all the black folks. I started reading the white folks. I read Alexander Hamilton and Helen Keller and Abraham Lincoln. Now, ended up with a little bit of a girl crush on Abraham Lincoln. He was the man. So through reading all of these books, it actually led me to my chosen career. It led me there because I understood through the journey of all of these people that all of the significant impact that was made in society that personally affected me, and I knew would continue to affect generations to come, came through the practice of law. And I knew nothing about the practice of law. I did not know any lawyers at that time, but I knew I wanted to be a lawyer. I wanted to be a part of that profession that was a part of the change that helped people. And I began my journey and stuck to it. all because of that few minutes after class that Mr. Art Smith told me to go and read the biographies of people. It's amazing what the teachers in your village can do, even down to the way that I talk. I didn't always speak this way with clarity. I mean, I grew up in a hometown, in a neighborhood where everybody spoke using Ebonics. It's no different than if you grow up in New Orleans and you speak Cajun, or if you grow up in the Bronx and you speak the Bronx. I mean, whatever slang that comes with your community and neighborhood, children tend to adapt to that, and so did I. So here I was, by the time I got to the 8th grade, this extremely bright kid on paper, high standardized test scores, high grades on my report card, honor student. Everybody, knew me as smart. And yet I had an 8th grade English teacher that put me in speech therapy, as you read in the book. And I certainly didn't understand it at the time, but I understand it now. Again, my village pouring into me and shaping who I became as an adult. And it didn't stop there. This continued on through high school, through my coaches in track and cheer that taught me so much about self-discipline and determination and perseverance, through the teachers that encouraged me to participate in college program for first generation students, like an Upward Bound program, or going to college campuses for summer programs, not knowing all this time that scholarships were available, or through an educator that when I wanted to study for the ACT, the standardized test that most kids take in Alabama for college admittance, when I wanted to improve my score and utilize the resources, and I didn't have a computer at home to do that with. And the principal and the teacher came together to give me access to the computer lab in the morning before homeroom when my bus got there for me to study and work. My village. And probably the most significant of that story is that the janitor who met me at the front door of the school and came and unlocked that door for me to have access to get to those computers to study for the ACT. Every morning I'd go in there, she would say, you got this, baby. So needless to say, when my test scores went up high enough for me to get a full scholarship to college, that janitor was one of the first persons that I told. And then, of course, the teacher and the principal, they were my village that helped shape me to who I am today. Now, let me say this as I close out. I mean, you read More Than a Bird and all of those lovely stories about all of the educators that poured into me. But there's also the spiritual educator that pours into me as well. But the two somewhat go hand in hand, which is why I believe that these are two of God's greatest ministries, although he loves people in other ways. But these two are amazing. So when I was in the 3rd grade, and I'm fixing to tell you why I named this little book More Than a Bird. When I was in the 3rd grade, things were really bad. And, we had the uncle there by then that was being violent, and I was still being sexually abused by the other uncle that was in the home. And it was just chaos, never knowing what was going to happen. And I'll never forget this. On the last day of school for the summer, I remember getting on the bus in order to go home for the summer. And for most kids, my kids, many of your kids, for most of us, the last day of school is an exciting time. You're getting ready to go swimming and vacation and camps and all of these enriching activities and sleep in and all of those things. But for me, it was a scary moment. And it was a scary moment because I was about to go into my reality 24/7, 7 days a week. And it wasn't pleasant, never knowing what might happen each day. And so I went into a depression. I literally not just cried as that bus was pulling away from the school and my school was fading in the distance. I wept. I wept because I was leaving my precious school. I was leaving the one place where I knew I was going to get a meal. I was leaving the one place where no adult hurt me. I was leaving the one place where my mind was stimulated to learn. I was leaving the one place where I felt like a child. And it hurt. It hurt bad. Like it hurts for so many children in America today that are home because of COVID-19. Because sometimes school is the best place for them. It hurt. And so I went into this depression. Well, 2 weeks after that, my Aunt Liz invited me to this church with her. And I went not because I wanted to go learn about God. I didn't have an appreciation for that at that time. I went because it got me out of my house at night when the bad things happen. So I get to the church, and I'll never forget this little small church, new in the community. And the minister told everybody to get out their Bibles. Well, I'd never had a Bible and never really read a Bible. And he said, well, if you don't have one will be provided to you. So they handed me a Bible. But because of school, I could read, and I could read well. And thank God I could read well. They handed me a King James version of the Bible. So they give me this Bible, and I'm starting to read all of these stories with my own eyes and experience an emotion I'd never experienced before. It's this thing called hope. I'm reading about this God that had helped all these people overcome all of these things in their life. And we closed that night in the book of Genesis with the story of Joseph. And you people of faith out there know about the story of Joseph. Now, that was one hot mess if I ever saw one in my life. Talk about a dysfunctional family. You had those 10 boys with 3 or 4 different baby mamas, and it was just a mess. And Joseph was daddy's favorite, but the boys were so jealous of that boy that they ended up selling him to slavery and going back and telling the dad that he had gotten killed. And so y'all know the story. Joseph, he's with this master. He's highly educated. He goes to prison. He's beaten in prison. Ultimately, the Pharaoh learns that he can interpret dreams, and he's very intelligent and decides to bring him out. And at the end of this story that started out with such tragedy, Joseph ended up as governor of Egypt. And in that capacity, not only did he save his family from famine and starvation, he saved 2 nations from famine and starvation. So that night I sat there and I said, if this God can help Joseph, maybe he can help me. So the next Wednesday, she didn't have to ask, I went with her. And we went through lots of scriptures that night. And we ended in Matthew 6:26, and I'll paraphrase. It says that if God will take care of the fowls of the air, and they neither sow nor reap, then he'll take care of his children. Are they not better than a bird? Well, the tragedy in that moment was that I sat there and I struggled with whether or not I was more than a bird. Because to me, it seemed like the birds had it better than I did. But then the preacher said this. He said, you know that you're more than a bird because God will send people to love you. He will send people to love you even when the people you think should be taking care of you aren't. And when he said that, it was like a light bulb came on. All I could think about in that moment was my school and my teachers and how God had really sent people to love me. And faith came into my heart. And I began my spiritual journey of learning how to live my life through the Word of God. And I stayed on my natural journey of using education, the great equalizer, the great village of community of hope, to have a better quality of life here on earth. And from preschool to law school, God always sent educators like you to love me. And for that reason, I know, and I know all of the students that will come across your path are more than a bird. And I want you to know that I pray the greatest prayer over all of you this year as we navigate through this challenging time, so that you find your creative way to continue to be that village to your students. Because now, in this environment, it doesn't matter where a child comes from. They're all adversely affected by the state we're in today in this country. And I just want to say thank you. I want to say thank you for what you're pouring into, and show you a picture of my beautiful family to show you the end result of a village pouring into a child. And here's my information if you need me. And please reach out and continue to do what you do. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your year.
Thank you so much, Liz, for those encouraging words, a reminder that we are more than a bird, and the opportunity to be game-changing individuals right here in our very own village.
Yeah, being a game-changing teacher, a game-changing leader, a game-changing individual, it's all important. And I think my key takeaway from Liz's message is about the individual. So how can you make someone feel really special by seeing them, hearing them, loving them, and pouring into them as an individual person? That's just such a powerful statement, a powerful reminder of how we can continue to move forward.
We've heard a lot of great speakers today, a lot of great stories, and you might be thinking, what is it that I can do today? What is it that I can do right now to support my village? So let's talk a little bit more about how we can take a moment to dive into what some of those things are.
Yeah, that's great, because we can hear a lot of things, we can feel a lot of great things, but if we don't do something about that, then we're missing a key component. And so we need that call to action, so to say, to make sure that we are having an impact. So let's talk a little bit more about what opportunities are available.
As we wrap up today's event, moving forward, there's going to be lots of opportunities for you to continue to lead, learn, lean in, not too close, Hannah.
Not too close.
Share a text with a friend, provide a word of encouragement. If you heard something great and powerful today, post it on social media. Take a moment to continue to pour into each other and continue to move forward in your village.
That's true. And there's opportunity right now to lean into Seafoot and get involved to continue to do those things of learning, leading, and leaning. And so a couple things that come to mind are we do have a summer school opportunity. So if you're an aspiring teacher, let's say you're a support teacher, you're a teacher that's in your first year and you're thinking, man, I could use some extra tools in my toolkit, or I want some at-bats at building my own classroom or building my own school culture. This would be a great opportunity for you to get involved. And we already mentioned the leadership component. If you are an aspiring leader and you want to get that at-bat and that opportunity to feel what it's like to lead a whole school and a whole staff, that's a great opportunity for you to get involved.
In the spring, we look forward to bringing back the village for our night of fun and festivities at our annual trivia night.
Trivia night is so fun. You have to get involved. There's dress up, there's food, there's all the fun things.
So Hannah, when we're not playing trivia, what are some other opportunities where teachers can learn, lead, and lean into each other?
Yeah, well, we're always here serving for professional development opportunities. I know I mentioned one earlier, some of our how to have students engaged in a virtual world. That's a popular one. But if your staff is looking for any type of workshop or learning opportunity, our coaches are ready and they're ready to jump in and offer any type of support that they can.
And another way that we support our undergraduates and those who are looking to enter into the teaching field is through our conference also in February called Unite.
Unite is such a great opportunity for those aspiring teachers to get together, to get to know each other, to learn from really awesome speakers in the community. It's just a really great day for networking and professional growth. So definitely get involved if you're someone who's thinking about becoming a teacher and stepping into that role.
Get involved. Thank you so much for spending your day with us today. As you've heard, whether it's a conference called Unite or It Takes a Village or having fun through trivia, there's a common message that even during these tough times where perhaps we're encouraged to be a part, Hannah, we know that it takes a village and our combined efforts to continue to collaborate, smile, have a little fun, and continue to encourage each other to move forward and do great things for our village. Thank you. And God bless.
Thank you so much. There are a couple logistical notes for you. On our webpage, you'll find an evaluation link. We would love your feedback. Please, please, please. This is the first time we've done this conference in a virtual format. Not sure if it's going to be on the calendar for next year or not in a virtual way, but we will let time tell. There's also a link for a certificate of completion, which is going to be helpful for you in your own portfolio. And just a reminder for anyone who's working through some paperwork that they may need to do for their school. If you need screenshots or if you need signatures, any of that, just connect with your leader at your school to see if that is something that applies to you. But like Jose said, we appreciate your time with us. Thank you. Continue to serve the village and serve the village well.
We'll see you next year.